The morning of the Harcastle Assembly, everyone in Derbyshire knew the Duke of Aldenmere had arrived. They knew because the roads from the north had been quiet for 3 days, and then suddenly they were not. 2 carriages bearing his crest passed through the village before dawn, and by the time the candles were lit in the Assembly Hall's upper windows, the footman at the door had been replaced by his own. The assembled county had not seen him in 4 years. The assembled county had spent 4 years wondering why. Cecily Marsh did not arrive by carriage. She arrived on foot, her boots worn thin at the right heel, a borrowed shawl too light for October pinned across her shoulders, with a brooch that had belonged to her mother. She had walked 2 miles from the inn, where she washed linen for Mrs. Partridge, and the cold had found its way through the shawl by the time she reached the lantern-lit door. She was there because Mrs. Partridge's niece had taken ill and could not use her ticket, and because Cecily had not been to an assembly in 14 months, and because she was 23 years old, and the only alternative to one stolen evening was the gray arithmetic of another winter earning wages that could not quite cover the rent. She was not supposed to be there. The room knew it the moment she entered. Not allowed. They were too polished for that. She felt it in the adjustments, the slight turn of Mrs. Aldgate's shoulder, the way Lady Fenn's fan paused at half-height, the brief shared glance between the Hartley sisters that said everything a cut direct would have said with less effort. Cecily had been a gentleman's daughter once. She had been Miss Marsh of Westfield, with a small but respectable dowry and a father who sat on the vestry. That was before the debts surfaced, before the house was sold, before the year that had taken everything and deposited her at the bottom of the county's estimation with no visible means of climbing back. To this room, she was a charity ticket, a ghost who had forgotten she was dead. She took a position near the south wall, behind the potted fern that had been there as long as anyone could remember, and she watched the dancers, and she tried to remember what it had felt like to stand in a room like this and belong to it. She had not yet seen the Duke. She did not know, in those first minutes, that she was being watched. He stood at the far end of the room near the windows that overlooked the garden, and he had been there for 20 minutes, declining every introduction his host attempted, and ignoring every glance from every mother in the room with a patience that suggested he had spent years learning how to be invisible in the middle of a crowd. He was 34 years old, with dark hair worn close, a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from something harder than bone, and eyes the color of winter river water. He wore a navy coat fitted precisely to his shoulders and said nothing to anyone, and the entire room arranged itself at a careful distance around him and pretended not to be watching. He was watching the south wall. More specifically, he was watching the woman behind the potted fern. He recognized her. He had not expected to. 4 years ago, before his life became what it had become, he had seen her once at her father's house on a matter of business, when she had been perhaps 19, carrying an armful of books up the staircase, and she had apologized for being in the way with a quiet gravity that had stayed with him longer than it should have. He had not known then that the world was about to rearrange itself in the particular way it had. He had not known, then, what he now knew, which was that Cecily Marsh had once done him a service she did not know she had done. In a moment she had almost certainly forgotten, and that he had been in her debt ever since. Mrs. Aldgate found him at the window 10 minutes later, her fan moving at the precise speed that indicated she had something to say. "I see we have an unexpected guest this evening," she said, directing her gaze toward the south wall with the delicacy of a woman pointing at something she found mildly offensive. He looked at her. He said nothing. "Miss Marsh," Mrs. Aldgate continued, in the tone she reserved for subjects that required tact. "You may not have heard. Her father passed 2 years ago. Some difficulty with the estate. I understand she is in service now. It is kind of Mrs. Partridge to include her in these things. One does not like to see a gentlewoman brought quite so low. She paused. Though one does wonder if the kindness is entirely wise. It gives a woman ideas about her station that reality cannot support. He looked at Mrs. Aldgate for a moment. I wonder, he said, his voice very level. What kind of ideas you mean? She laughed, as though he had made a small joke. She had not heard what was underneath it. He turned back to the window. If you have ever wondered what it means to hold knowledge you cannot use, stay a little longer. This story begins with a secret, and secrets in this world do not keep. They surface, always, in the bodies of the people carrying them. The summer before the assembly, Cecily had been sent to Aldenmere Park on an errand for Mrs. Partridge, who supplied the household with a particular thread she could obtain nowhere else in the county. It was a small errand, simply, carry the parcel to the servants' entrance, wait for receipt, and return. The kind of errand that required a person to see nothing and hear nothing and report nothing. Cecily was good at such errands. She had been practicing invisibility for 2 years and had become, she thought, rather accomplished at it. She had arrived at the back of the great house in the early afternoon and found the servants' entrance unattended. She had waited for a quarter of an hour on the stone step outside the door, and then, because it was raining and the doorway only partially kept the weather out, she had stepped inside the passage that led to the kitchen corridor, intending only to stand where it was dry. She had heard voices. She had not meant to. The corridor turned before the kitchen, and the voices were around the turn, and she had been inside the passage before she understood that what she was hearing was not an ordinary household conversation. She had heard the Duke's voice, which she recognized because she had met him once, briefly, at her father's house, and she had remembered it the way one remembers things that seemed unimportant at the time and later prove otherwise. And she had heard a second voice, lower, with an accent she could not place, and what she had heard the second voice say had not made sense to her in the moment, though it made a great deal more sense now. She had taken her receipt and left. She had said nothing to Mrs. Partridge. She had said nothing to anyone. Not because she had decided to keep a secret, but because she did not know what she had heard, and because saying something she did not understand seemed more dangerous than saying nothing at all. She had been carrying it since August. It was now October. It had not gotten lighter. She had developed, in those 2 months, a set of small rituals for not thinking about it. She kept her hands occupied. She took the route to market that passed closest to the noise of the village and farthest from the back road that skirted Aldenmere's kitchen garden wall. She went to bed early and rose early and filled her days with the particular industry of someone who understands, without stating it, that idleness is dangerous. None of this had worked. Knowledge does not respond to industry. It sits at the back of the mind and waits, with the patient indifference of something that has nowhere else to be. She did not know, standing behind the potted fern, that the Duke had seen her at Aldenmere that afternoon. She did not know that he had come to the window of his study and watched her walk back across the kitchen garden in the rain, and that he had sent his steward after her not to stop her, but to find out who she was, and that he had spent the 2 months since then in a particular state of suspension, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It had not dropped. She had said nothing. He could not understand why she had said nothing, and the not understanding had become its own kind of weight. He crossed the room toward the south wall. She saw him coming. She had 5 seconds to choose her expression, and she chose neutrality, because it was the expression she had been practicing longest, and because every other option seemed catastrophic. He was very tall. She had forgotten how tall. She straightened slightly against the wall, adjusted the borrowed shawl, and told herself to breathe. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, which was close enough to be noticed, and far enough to be technically defensible as courtesy. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Your Grace." Her voice held. She had not been certain it would. "I believe you have been standing behind this particular fern for 40 minutes, he said. "I find the view excellent." Something altered in his face. Not quite amusement, not quite acknowledgement. He said, "I believe we have some acquaintance. You were kind enough to visit my father's house when you were a girl. You are generous to call it acquaintance." "I call things what they are," he said. "Will you walk with me?" It was not quite a question. She recognized the texture of it, the command dressed as consideration, the instruction that left the door open while making clear which way the situation was pointing. She thought of the voices around the corner. She thought of what she had heard and not said. She thought of the weight she had been carrying since August, and how it had become heavier in the last 30 seconds. She took the arm he offered, because declining it in front of Mrs. Aldgate and the Hartley sisters would have required a reason she did not have. They walked. The room parted for him with the automatic deference of water around something solid, and Cecily felt for the first time in 2 years what it was to move through a room and not feel its edges pressing in. The garden terrace was cold. He stopped at the stone balustrade and looked out at the dark lawn and said nothing for long enough that she understood he was thinking carefully about what to say. "You were at Aldenmere in August," he said at last, "in the kitchen passage." "I was delivering a parcel for Mrs. Partridge." "You heard a conversation." She did not answer immediately. The cold had found the gap at her collar, and she did not let it show. "I heard voices," she said. "I did not hear anything I understood. And yet you said nothing." "I had nothing to say." He turned to look at her. In the light from the French windows, he looked older than 34. Or perhaps it was not age, but a particular kind of weight, carried for long enough that it had settled into the bones of his face. "I have been watching you for 2 months, he said, "waiting to see what you would do with it." She felt the cold more sharply now. "And what have I done with it?" "Nothing," he said. "Precisely nothing." Which is either the action of someone who understood nothing of what she heard, or someone who understood exactly what she heard and chose, for reasons I cannot explain, to protect a man she has no reason to protect. She held his gaze. She did not look away. "Or," she said carefully, "the action of someone who understood enough to know that some knowledge is too large to carry and too dangerous to put down, and who chose the only path that seemed to cause the least harm." He was quiet for a long moment. The orchestra inside had begun a country dance, and the sound of it came through the glass, bright and distant, like music from another world. "You are not what the county thinks you are," he said. "The county decided what I was 2 years ago," she said. "They have not found it necessary to revisit the question." "No," he said. "They would not." He looked at her for another moment, and then said, "Come inside." "You are cold." She was. She went. The conversation had lasted perhaps 12 minutes on the terrace. What it had seeded in her was less easy to measure. She had spent 2 months not thinking about the voices in the passage, and now she could think of nothing else. And she could feel, though she would not have named it yet, that something had shifted in the particular shape of her situation. She did not see him again that evening. He left before the last dance, and Mrs. Aldgate watched him go with an expression that suggested considerable recalibration. On the walk back to Mrs. Partridge's in the dark, with the borrowed shawl pulled tighter and the right heel of her boot finding every stone on the road, Cecily did not allow herself to think about what had happened. She was 23 years old. She worked for her keep. She was the sort of woman who was sent on errands to houses where she once would have been a guest, and she knew the difference between a titled man extending a brief courtesy to someone who was in his debt and a man of rank meaning something by it. She put the evening in its box and walked home. It was a cold walk. The frost was already starting at the edges of the road, and the sky overhead was the particular starless black of a country night in October, without comfort or depth. She walked with her arms crossed over the borrowed shawl and told herself that nothing had happened that she needed to examine. A duke had spoken to her on a terrace and asked her to walk and said nothing definitive. This was not unusual. People of his rank said things that were not definitive because indefiniteness was a form of protection. And she understood protection, and she was not going to mistake a practiced courtesy for anything else. She believed this for approximately half the walk home. The other half she spent not believing it, which was its own kind of problem. She found the letter under Mrs. Partridge's door 2 mornings later. It was not from the Duke. It was from a man she had never heard of, with a London address. And it said, in very few words, that it had come to his attention that she had been in the kitchen passage at Aldenmere Park in August, and that he would very much appreciate a private meeting to discuss what she might have heard, and that he was in a position to offer her a considerable sum for her time and her recollection. She read it twice. She set it down on the kitchen table. She looked at the window over the sink, where the morning light was gray and thin, and the yard beyond it was full of linen waiting to be washed. She picked the letter up and burned it in the grate without answering. What she had heard in the passage was this. The second voice had said, in the particular flat tone of someone making a transaction, that the papers were ready to be transferred, and that the Duke's silence would ensure the other party's cooperation, and that if the Duke chose not to remain silent, there were people who had a great interest in what those papers contained. The Duke had said, very quietly, that he understood. The second voice had said, in parting, that it was always best when gentlemen understood one another. What Cecily had understood from that exchange was that someone was blackmailing the Duke of Aldenmere. She had not known what the papers contained. She still did not. She knew only that whoever held them believed the knowledge was potent enough to compel the silence of one of the most considerable men in Derbyshire, and that the same person now knew that she existed and had decided she might be useful. She was not going to be useful. She had made that decision without much deliberation, the way she made most of the decisions that turned out to matter. She made them quietly, from the part of herself that had remained steady all through the losses, the part that knew what it would and would not do, regardless of the cost. She was frightened. She was not going to pretend, not even to herself, that she was not frightened. The second letter arrived a week after she burned the first. This one had no return address, and it was not an invitation. It said that her continued silence would be noted and rewarded, that her cooperation was valued, and that she should consider carefully the difference between a woman who had nothing to lose and a woman who had already lost everything. It ended by saying, with a delicacy, that made it worse rather than better, that it would be a shame if a woman in her position were to find her current employment difficult to maintain. She did not burn this one immediately. She held it for 3 days, taking it out when Mrs. Partridge was occupied and reading it again, turning it over, trying to see the shape of the threat clearly so she could measure it against the alternatives. On the 3rd day, she walked to the village, found the Duke's steward at the inn, and asked him to take a message to Aldenmere. The Duke came himself, which she had not expected. He came the following morning, alone, on horseback, without the carriages or the footmen, or any of the visible apparatus of his rank, and he knocked at the servants' door of Mrs. Partridge's house and waited with the patience of a man who had learned patience the hard way. She brought him into the kitchen, which was the only room available to her, and she put the letter on the table in front of him without comment. He read it. His face did not change. but she watched his hand on the letter's edge and saw it still completely, the way a hand stills when the body is doing its strongest work. "How long?" he said. "That is the second. The first came a week ago. I burned it." He looked up at her. "Why?" "Because I had no use for it." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have come to me at once." "I did not know if coming to you would make matters better or worse," she said honestly. "I did not know what your situation was. I still do not. I know only what I heard, which I still do not fully understand, and what these letters suggest about who sent them." He set the letter down. "What do you think you heard?" "I think someone is holding documents over you. I think you have been complying with their requests. I think they now believe that I am a complication, and have decided to manage me before I become one." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you this not because I want to be managed, but because I thought you should know the shape of things." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was very small. The fire in the range was inadequate against the October cold, and she was aware of the thinness of her morning dress and the state of her hands, and the particular indignity of being obliged to receive a duke in a room that smelled of soap and yesterday's bread. He said very quietly, "They are letters. From my father, written before his death, to a business associate of his who proved to be a swindler. My father did not know. The letters implicate the duchy in dealings that were fraudulent, though my father's involvement was innocent. The man who holds them has been using them for 2 years. I have been paying him to stay quiet, and he has been getting more confident." She absorbed this. "Why have you not gone to a solicitor?" "Because a solicitor would mean the letters becoming known. My father's name would not survive it. The duchy might not survive it." He stopped. "My father was a good man who was deceived. He has been dead 3 years. He cannot answer for it." She thought of her own father, who had also been a good man, and had also been deceived, and had also not survived it. She thought of what it costs to carry the weight of someone else's mistake, simply because you loved them, and they were gone, and there was no one left to carry it but you. "I see," she said. "If you are still here, you understand what it is to carry something alone, and why putting it down is not as simple as simply setting it down. There is a moment, though. For some people, there is a moment." She said, "I think there is a solicitor in the county who could be trusted with this. My father's solicitor, Mr. Vane. He is old and careful, and he has no reason to speak of things that do not serve his clients." He looked at her. "You are suggesting I trust the situation to a stranger." "I am suggesting," she said, "that the alternative is to continue paying a man who will never stop asking, while people like me are used as leverage. I am not willing to be leverage indefinitely, and I do not think you are willing to pay indefinitely. The letters exist. They will exist whether you pay or not. The question is whether you manage them or whether he manages you." Something shifted in his face. It was not the shift of a man hearing a new idea. It was the shift of a man hearing a thing he had already thought and had not allowed himself to say aloud. "You are more than the county thinks you are," he said. "I know what I am," she said. "I would appreciate it if you did not say so as though it were a surprise." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something in that territory. He took the letter. He came back 4 days later, again alone, again at the servants' entrance, and this time he was carrying a parcel. Books, it turned out, 3 of them, which he set on the kitchen table without explanation. She looked at them. A volume of natural history with hand-colored plates. A collection of essays in a binding she recognized as expensive. a novel she had heard discussed and never been able to obtain. He had, she thought, paid attention at some point to what kind of person she was, and this was the result. It was the most careful thing anyone had done for her in 2 years, and she was not going to say so. "For your time," he said. "My time cost you nothing." "Then for your judgment," he said, "which cost you more than you will say." She looked at the books. She did not know what to do with them. She did not know what to do with any of this. The letters, the Duke at her kitchen table, the growing awareness that she had been managing something that had, in the past week, become considerably larger than a borrowed shawl and a wrong-heeled boot. Mr. Vane was amenable, he said. He stood with his hands at his sides, not touching the table, not filling the room the way men of rank usually filled rooms, staying very precisely in the space she had indicated was available to him. "The letters can be legally retrieved. The man holding them overestimated his position. He assumed the documents were worth more to me than the cost of their removal. He was wrong. He underestimated what you were willing to risk," she said. "He underestimated what had become worth protecting," he said. And the way he said it was level, carefully level, as though the words had been prepared in advance, and he had decided to say them exactly as prepared, and not one syllable differently. She looked at the books. She said, "You should go. Mrs. Partridge will be home from the market within the hour." "Yes," he said. He did not move immediately. "I will call on you properly," he said. "Through the front door, if you are willing." She looked up at him. "I am telling you plainly," he said. And his voice was still level. But underneath the level there was something else. Something she had no name for yet. Something that the body recognized before the mind permitted. "I am telling you because I have spent 4 years learning that not telling people things plainly costs more than it saves." The kitchen was still small. The fire was still inadequate. She was still 23 years old and employed by Mrs. Partridge and in possession of one borrowed shawl and no particular expectation of her future. She said, "Through the front door, then." He called through the front door the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. Mrs. Partridge, who was not a foolish woman, said nothing to Cecily, and everything to everyone she met in the village, and the county, which had spent 2 years treating her as a woman who had ceased to exist, began the rapid, slightly embarrassed process of revising its opinion. The Hartley sisters were the first. They called on a Wednesday, which was Mrs. Partridge's baking day, and sat in the front parlor and spoke to Cecily with an attentiveness that they had conspicuously not offered her in 14 months, and she received them with the quiet dignity that had been her primary possession during all of that time. She was not warm. She was not cold. She was simply, precisely, herself, and she watched them recalibrate in real time, the way people recalibrate when the information changes. This is the county, she thought, and this is what the county does, and none of it is personal, which is its own small mercy. Lady Fenn called on a Thursday. She was more direct. She said, "I understand you have been receiving visits from Aldenmuir." She said it in the tone she used for statements that were actually questions. "Yes," Cecily said, and offered her no more than that. Lady Fenn left after 20 minutes and told the county's other principal opinion-makers that Miss Marsh had become formidably composed, which in the county's vocabulary meant that she was no longer someone who could be managed, and which in practice meant that she was no longer someone to whom the dismissal applied. He had not yet spoken plainly beyond the promise to call properly. He came twice a week and stayed an appropriate interval and said things that were not quite what he meant, and watched her with the specific patience of a man who had been holding himself at a careful distance for reasons that were dissolving. She understood the distance. She understood it because she knew now what he had been carrying. And she knew that a man who has been carrying a secret for 4 years and managing a threat for 2 does not simply set those habits down the moment the threat is resolved. He had learned to protect what mattered by not naming it. She could see the habit in him, the precise calibration of his proximity, the sentences that stopped half a word short, the particular stillness he kept when she said something that landed in him, and he chose, from long practice, not to show it. She could see it because she had her own version of it. She had learned, in 2 years of service, not to want things, not to look at what she had lost and name the shape of the loss, because naming it gave it mass, and mass was weight, and she was already carrying enough. She had put her expectations away very tidily into a box she kept at the back of herself, and she had gotten very good at not looking at the box. And the difficulty was that somewhere between August and November, the box had started asking to be opened. She did not open it. She waited for him to say the thing he was not yet saying. On a Tuesday, in the 3rd week of November, he came later than usual, and there was a frost on the ground, and Mrs. Partridge had gone to her niece's, and the fire in the front parlor was the only one lit. He sat across from her and said nothing in particular for 20 minutes, and she watched the fire and waited. He said, "The letters have been destroyed." "I know," she said. "Mr. Vane wrote to tell me." He said, "You did not tell me he had written to you. He wrote to tell me that I was no longer in any danger from the matter. He believed I should know." "He was right," he said. He looked at his hands. He had large hands, and he kept them very still, which she had noticed before. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said to me in the kitchen, about the shape of things." She said nothing. She knew by now that the spaces he left were not invitations to fill, but paces he needed to take alone. "I have not managed my affairs well," he said. "I have been managing them carefully, which is not the same thing. Careful management keeps things from getting worse. It does not make anything better." He looked up. "You made something better. You did not do it for me. I understand that. You did it because it was the right shape of action, and you are a person who knows the right shape of action." She said, "I did it because someone was trying to use me, and I did not care to be used." "That too," he said. "Both things are true." The fire had settled. Outside, the frost was hardening on the ground, and through the parlor window, the last light was leaving the sky in the slow, particular way that October light leaves in the north. He said, "I would like to speak to you plainly." "You have been speaking plainly," she said. "I have been listening." He looked at her. Something in his face was different, not the careful containment she had come to know, but something underneath it. Something that had been kept very still for a long time and had, in the last 60 seconds, decided not to be still anymore. "I would like to speak to you very plainly," he said, and his voice was still level, but the level had a different quality now, the way a room sounds different when the door is opened. "About what I am asking. I am asking because I know what I am asking is considerable, and I know what you have been through, and I know that a proposal from a man who arrived at your kitchen door in October and sat in your parlor for 3 weeks is not the same as a proposal that has been given the time it deserves. I know this." She was very still. The fire made a small sound. She was aware of every inch of the distance between his chair and hers. He said, "But I am asking. And I wanted you to know that I am asking from a place that has nothing to do with obligation or with the letters or with gratitude, though I am also grateful. I am asking because you are the only person I have spoken to in 4 years from whom I could not hide what I actually meant. and I have found that I do not want to hide it." She breathed. She was aware of the quality of the air in the room, and the frost outside, and the worn armrest of the chair she was sitting in, and the particular weight of the box at the back of herself that she had kept so carefully closed. She said, "You should know that I have very little. I have the sense to know the shape of things, and the stubbornness to hold to it. And that is nearly everything I can offer." "I know that," he said. "Those are the things I'm asking for." She looked at him. She looked at his face, the jaw like carved stone, and the eyes the color of winter river water, and something in them that was not winter at all, something that had been there since the terrace at the Harcastle Assembly, and that she had been not looking at for 6 weeks because she had not been ready to see it. She said, "Then yes." The parlor fire burned. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he leaned forward very slightly, and she leaned forward very slightly, and the distance between them closed in the way that distances close when two people have been closing it slowly, for a long time without permission, and his hand covered hers on the arm of the chair, and they sat like that, with the frost outside and the fire inside, and the world going on about its business as though nothing had changed. Something had changed. The county required approximately 2 weeks to fully process the intelligence, after which it arranged itself into its customary opinion that it had always thought well of Miss Marsh, that her qualities had always been evident to those paying attention, and that the Duke of Aldenmere had shown excellent judgment in selecting a woman of such substance and composure. Mrs. Aldgate was among the early revisionists. She called at Aldenmere in December, before the formal announcement, and paid Cecily a compliment so thorough and so precisely calibrated to erase the memory of every prior interaction that Cecily received it with a grace that cost her considerably more than it appeared to. Lady Fenn sent a note. The Hartley sisters, who had more conscience than most, sent a note that acknowledged, in careful but readable terms, that they had not behaved as they ought, and that they hoped she would not find their prior behavior unforgivable. Cecily wrote back warmly. She was not in the business of extracting satisfaction from people who were sorry. The man with the letters had removed himself from the county before Mr. Vane's intervention was complete. This was, Mr. Vane said, the most prudent decision the man had made in a considerable time. He was not heard from again. The second letter, the one Cecily had kept for 3 days before taking it to the Duke's steward, had been burned along with the first one, and the original letters from the old Duke to his fraudulent associate had been destroyed in Mr. Vane's office with 2 witnesses present. There was no remaining evidence of any of it, and there was therefore nothing left for the county to know. And the Duke of Aldenmere's name was exactly as it had been before, a name attached to a man who kept his own counsel and his estate in excellent order, and was now, it seemed, going to be married. The wedding was in January, which was earlier than most expected, and less elaborate than most hoped for, and which suited Cecily perfectly. She wore ivory, with cream gloves, and a sprig of winter holly in her hair that the housekeeper at Aldenmere had found for her, with the brisk tenderness that characterized most of the household's welcome of her. The ceremony was quiet. It was cold. It was exactly what she wanted. He had found, in the study at Aldenmere, a small watercolor portrait of her father, which had been in the collection for years, and which she had not known was there. A commission from decades ago, when her father and his had been acquainted. He had it framed and hung in the morning room without commentary, and she had found it one afternoon in early February and stood before it for a long moment without speaking. She had not cried when her father died. She had been too occupied with the practical consequences of his death to give grief the time it needed, and she had learned, in the years since, to move around the loss, rather than through it. The portrait made the moving around no longer possible. She stood before it and let the grief come. Quietly, in the warm morning room with the winter sun through the windows, and when she was done, she straightened and adjusted the frame by a 1/4 inch and went on with her day. He found her in the morning room that evening and looked at the portrait and looked at her and said nothing, because he had learned that she did not need the grief named, only witnessed. He sat with her. The fire was good. Outside the windows, the snow that had been promising itself all day had begun to fall, and the grounds of Aldenmere turned white and quiet beneath it, and the light in the morning room was warm and still. On the mantelpiece, in a place she had chosen for it herself, was a small object, the brooch that had belonged to her mother, the one she had pinned her borrowed shawl with on the night of the Harcastle assembly. It was a plain thing, pewter and enamel, worth nothing in any marketplace. She had polished it and put it in the place she had chosen, and it sat there now as things sit when they have arrived somewhere they were always meant to be, quiet and small and exactly sufficient. She did not look at it. She did not need to. She knew it was there. The snow went on falling, and the fire went on burning, and she was warm.